So, welcome to today's webinar on understanding racial injustice and its impact on student mental health. This is session 3, affirming strategies to promote student success. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. And also this webinar is co-hosted by the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, housed at La Universidad Central del Caribe. My name is Catty Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of this center. So a little bit about us. The Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center provides 5 years from 2018 to 2023, and it's designed to enhance the capacity of behavioral health workforce to deliver evidence-based and promising practices, address the full continuum of services spanning mental illness and prevention, treatment and recovery supports, and then train related workforces to provide effective services to people with mental illnesses. We invite you to subscribe to our mailing list by clicking on the bit.ly link that you see on your screen. And also I will be sending this link as part of our follow-up email, including our evaluation survey, so that you can be kept up to date with our latest resources and technologies and free trainings. Also, at the end of this webinar, we will ask that you please complete an evaluation survey. We have a QR code for your convenience, and we also have a link. The completion of these surveys are very important to us because this is how we are funded. We get credit for every survey that's completed as a participant that completed a training program with us. So, and we also invite you to provide any additional feedback that may also come to mind, and I will put my contact information in the email. Also note that we will be recording this session, and then we're going to be posting it to our website along with the presentation slides and any relevant resources that we have. Also, your interactions with us on our Zoom platform, we have a question and answers feature, and you'll see that in the menu bar. And we invite you to send us your questions that you may have for the presenters. We also have chat and polls. In this webinar, we don't have any polls, but we do invite you to use the chat feature if you'd like to send us a message or even interact with other colleagues that are attending our webinar today. Also, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. Please do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCants-Katz served as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. So the opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now I'm going to turn over the webinar to our school mental health lead. Her name is PJ Wenger, who will be introducing the webinar series as well as our presenters today.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Very excited. This is the third and final and its impact on student mental health. Very excited. It has been a wonderful journey, and I've learned a lot from our two speakers who are here today. This webinar will provide strategies for student mental health and affirming approaches that capitalize on student strengths and avoid reinforcing stigmatizing beliefs. So our first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Kimmy Carlos. Kimmy Carlos is the founder of Urban Mental Health Alliance, advocating for healthy minds in urban communities. She is the CEO and founder of Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting and co-founder and lead facilitator of Sister Wellness Retreats, Healing Spaces for Black Women. Kimmy is also a health and wellness coach with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, a certified instructor for mental health first aid, and a trained anti-racist. Is the author of the published book, The Window of Grace, Living in Recovery Through Christian Faith. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter. Welcome, Kimmy Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you so much, PJ, and thank you to the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. Thank you to Katia, and thank you to Dr. Romero for presenting alongside of me. I am excited. This is our third presentation in the series, and as PJ said, it's just been a really wonderful opportunity to discuss some topics that were a long time coming. We are in a phenomenal time in history where we are having a lot of social justice reckoning. We're talking about justice and equity. We're looking at how we can better affirm and empower our students of color. And I am just thrilled to be a part of this change. So this particular topic, I really had to sit and do some thinking. In all authenticity and transparency, I am not an educator, but in my work as a mental health advocate and a social justice advocate, I spent a lot of time engaging with our students of color. And the strategies that I want to share are actually strategies that would benefit any student and any student of color, but you're going to hear me talk specifically about our Black boys and girls in our school systems. And so I had to really go and sit and think about, if I had pie in the sky, right? Money was no object, and I was given the opportunity to build strategies that I think would really affirm and empower our young Black boys and girls and our young trans and LGBTQ students of color. You know, what would I want to put in place? So I'm going to share two strategies that I think are important for our educators and one strategy that I think is important for our students. So we're going to spend the next 20 to 25 minutes kind of exploring those and why I feel these strategies would be so empowering and would help to affirm students of color who typically are not affirmed in the way that they need to actually grow and develop. So 3 strategies that I'm going to look at today. The first one is anti-racism training for educators, ACEs training for educators, and wellness resiliency. The slides keep moving. And wellness resiliency and self-advocacy training for students of color. You can go to the next slide now, Katia. And the reason I think that these 3 strategies are so important is because in addition to the education that our students need in order to grow and flourish, there also has to be a certain type of environment, right? And our students of color, especially our Black students, often find themselves in oppressive environments in the educational system. Some of it has to do with socioeconomics, but a lot of it has to do with the way Black students are viewed and the traumas that Black students bring into the classroom, which also drives behaviors of Black students that you see. So I purposely liked this little grid because it talked, I think that these 3 strategies will help our educators. And when I say educators, I mean teachers, I mean administration, I mean all the staff that revolves around these students in the world of education. I think that these 3 strategies would help to bring educators an opportunity to see the whole student, to see the student in multi-dimensions, as opposed to Black students and behavior problems, which is a lot of times the way our students are viewed, right? Either they're behaving or they're not behaving. And then there are a lot of unconscious biases around what Black students are capable of, what Black students should be doing, and we're gonna get into all that. I think that these 3 strategies, again, pie in the sky, would really be able to empower our students. So when we look at anti-racism training, we're gonna start there first. So we talked a lot about structural racism or systemic racism or infrastructural racism. All three of those terms pretty much mean the same thing. But if you really think about the way that impacts a student and education, right? So obviously we talked about what the definition is. Structural racism is the historical and ongoing racial discrimination and segregation of African American, Blacks in particularly, which is typically instigated or sanctioned by government. Structural racism creates inequality in every aspect of life. And this comes from Erase Racism organization. But this chart is really very stark. If you look at the upper right-hand corner of the graph on the left, you'll see it says housing discrimination causes residential segregation and unequal education opportunities. So if you think about historically racist policies like redlining and segregation, and how whole communities and whole generations were literally pushed into housing areas, usually poor urban housing areas, right? And then our educational system is based on our tax structure, right? So if you have a poor community that's paying little to no taxes and the education is based on that money, then clearly it's going to be subpar education, right? So you have students that are struggling with poverty, and then you're also having students that are struggling with subpar education, and that influences the opportunity for students to either go on to higher education or finding employment opportunities, which in turn, the impact of their subpar education in turn affects where they're going to live, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So this is one of the ways, one of the biggest ways that we see structural racism in education, and how that actually oppresses Black students, students of color, but especially Black students. There's a history in this country of the way Black families and Black communities have been oppressed and marginalized, and then it continues to be passed down from generation to generation because it literally affects the education of young Black children. And therefore they don't have the opportunity that other students would have opportunities in other communities. I want to also share that while this is steeped in racism, we know racism is actually born out of capitalism, right? And so a lot of these same issues that we see with this vicious cycle of poverty and subpar education and subpar housing also plays out in the Midwest and our rural areas as well. But that's very different from how the structural racism actually plays into it. So I just want to make sure there's a separation between the two. Capitalism and socioeconomics plays a large part in this, but when it comes to racism, it was designed that way. It was literally designed to oppress entire generations of Black and African American families. So I went and did a little research because I know there's a lot of work out there that's being done. Right here in Princeton, New Jersey, we're doing a phenomenal job of really beginning to look at systemic racism and how it plays out in our educational system, right? And a lot of that has to do with first understanding what systemic racism is. That's the hard part, right? Often, if your educators aren't aware of what racism is, aren't aware of how systemic racism is embedded in the educational system, as it is embedded in all of our systems in this country, and if they don't understand how that racism plays into unconscious biases, direct biases, it plays into the way Black students are viewed, the way Black students are treated, the way Black students are criminalized, right? The way Black students are adultified. You have to first understand what racism is. And so the Center for Racial Justice in Education, I did a lot of homework on, because I know they've been doing this work for a long time. And at the Center for Racial Justice in Education, they strongly believe that every educator has the power and potential to create racially just and equitable learning environments for the children in their care. So what does that mean? It means that the way a Black child in Trenton is viewed and the way a white child in Princeton is viewed are two very different things, right? And so it's important to understand where that difference comes from. And when you begin to recognize how systemic racism has played out in certain communities and why you see behaviors that come out of those communities, it gives you a better opportunity to view Black students holistically, right? In all the dimensions, as opposed to this little Black child who might have a behavioral problem, or this little Black child who's never in school, right? Or this little Black child who seems to have some learning disabilities, right? And so the first strategy that I think is so important is that educators begin to learn about anti-racism and begin to recognize how systemic racism plays a part in the educational system and in the way Black children are viewed. The difference between having an anti-racism view and having a non-racist view, right, is when you have an anti-racism view, you begin to view the world or your purview in how can I begin to dismantle or deconstruct barriers of oppression, right? So if you say I'm not a racist as opposed to I'm an anti-racist, right? An anti-racist says, okay, let me look at these systems and structures that might be oppressive to my students, especially my Black students, and how we can dismantle them and begin to build affirming strategies, right? But before we can get to understanding what might be oppressive, we have to understand systemic racism for what it is. And remember, we talked earlier in this series how systemic racism is not about individual behaviors, although individual behaviors and beliefs and biases grow out of racism, right? But systemic racism is about infrastructures. It's about barriers. It's about systems that have been built on superior and inferior. And so once we begin to understand what anti-racism is, we can begin to recognize areas that are oppressive, areas that are marginalizing, and we can begin to dismantle those so that we can further empower and educate our Black students. So the first strategy, as I said, was training our educators in anti-racism. The other strategy that I think is really important is training our educators around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Now, any child at all, can be a victim of adverse childhood experiences. We know this, all right? So I think all educators should be trained in this to be able to recognize this, but especially our students of color, and even more especially our Black students, because I think you've heard me talk about this before, the anti-Black violence that we see against students. I mean, if you just look at the news in the last couple of weeks and all the stories that have come out about Black children that have been brutalized and abused by law enforcement and by, adults who may not be law enforcement, but are still under the belief that it's their job to police Black bodies, you begin to understand the traumas that students experience, okay? When it comes to Black students. So you're going to see a lot more, or rather higher rates of adverse childhood experiences in Black communities and in Black culture because of the traumas and the generational trauma and the generational poverty that's been passed down. So we look at ACEs. ACEs are traumatic events that can have negative lasting effects on health and well-being of a child. And so it's research and knowledge that abuse and household dysfunction and neglect is going to be much higher in poorer communities, communities that are much more dense, and communities that have suffered traumas, right? And so you're going to look at children where people with 6 or plus ACEs can die 20 years younger on average than other people. If you look at 4 or more ACEs, there's 3 times the level of lung disease, 14 times the number of suicide attempts, 4.5 times more likely to develop depression, 2 times the level of liver disease, 4 times as likely to have begun intercourse by age 15, 11 times the level of intravenous drug use. Some of the major things that come out of the traumas of systemic racism and the traumas of poverty that comes out of systemic racism are high levels of domestic violence, high levels of gang warfare and street violence, and high levels of substance use disorder, high levels of depression and anxiety disorder, right? And so the way these adverse childhood experiences affect the child actually begins to grow into adulthood. So you look at disrupted neural development, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, social problems, and eventually early death. And so it's like a vicious cycle because we see all these physical, mental, and emotional challenges that grow out of these adverse childhood experiences. And then that behavior oftentimes gets criminalized as opposed to seen as a health condition. So I think every educator needs to really understand what adverse childhood experiences are, and then we can begin to look at ways that we can counter adverse childhood experiences, as opposed to seeing these behaviors in Black children and criminalizing those behaviors because we're not recognizing the traumas that are behind those behaviors. So I thought this chart was powerful. This comes from the nonprofit ACEs Connection. And it talks about the 3 different areas where a lot of adverse childhood experiences come out of. So 1 is household, 2 is community, and 3 is environment. And while I think household is pretty powerful, where it talks about divorce, incarceration of a family member, homelessness, parental mental illness, alcoholism, and drug abuse in the home. And environment, number 3, is pretty powerful, where we talk about climate crisis like record heat and droughts, wildfires and smoke, storms, flooding, sea levels rising, earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, right? But I think it's number 2, where you look at the bottom and you look at the roots of this tree and all the systemic injustices in the community. So when you talk about historical drama, substandard schools, lack of social capital and mobility, structural racism, poor water and air quality, violence, poverty, substandard wages, lack of jobs in the community, poor housing quality and affordability. These are systemic injustices that have been passed down from generation to generation that does not allow families to be able to rise above that poverty level. And we have children that are born into that. And these children are sitting in the classroom from age kindergarten with this type of trauma, with this type of baggage. And often, as I say, that's not recognized. But if our educators are trained on what ACEs is and how ACEs affects children and families and communities, then we can begin to look at how we can build affirming structures, policies, procedures, rules, as opposed to structures, policies, procedures, and rules that oppress and that criminalize Black children. So Black students are punished more harshly and more frequently than white students for the same offense. This is not an opinion, this is actually a fact. There's statistics that show this. We know this not only in our educational system, but in our justice system as well, right? And once a child is placed into the justice system, then we talk about the school to prison pipeline, which is a huge study that if you're not familiar with, I encourage you to go do some homework on it, right? And this is how Black communities are further oppressed and marginalized when their children and their young adults end up in the justice system. It normally starts in the school, right? And again, not recognizing behaviors that might be trauma response behaviors, depression response behaviors, and instead they're looked at as criminal behaviors and they're treated punitively as opposed to looking at them as potential health crises and how we can heal as opposed to how we can punish. So the CDC, Center for Disease Control, has a wealth of information on ACEs. But one of the things that I really liked is this chart, and I've shared this chart in numerous presentations. It talks about ways that we can counter adverse childhood experiences in communities, like strengthening economic supports for families, changing social norms to support parents and positive parenting, providing quality care and education early in life, enhancing parenting skills to promote healthy child development, and intervening to lessen harms and prevent future risks, right? So one of the things that I think is one of the most profound quotes that I ever heard was from Ralph Nader, where he said, "Justice is prevention and charity is administration." So we have a lot of organizations that do phenomenal work trying to support families and communities that are in poverty and that are in trauma, right? But what these steps are talking about is prevention, right? And prevention is justice. The more preventive measures we have, the more systemic justice we build into our procedures and practices, the less ACEs that we have on the back end, right? So if we look at how do we strengthen families, how do we strengthen communities, how do we educate, how do we empower, how do we affirm, how do we uplift? And these 5 areas are really strong areas where we can work to prevent ACEs, but we first need to educate our educators around what ACEs is and what to look for, because that information will empower educational systems to work to build better communities for their students, especially Black students. And finally, the last strategy is specifically for our youth. And again, these strategies would work well for any youth, but I'm talking specifically about Black youth because of the very unique challenges that Black Americans have in this country. And so I think it's really important that in addition to the training for educators and kind of reframing the culture in our schools, we also need to empower our students by teaching them healing and resiliency and self-advocacy. So I found this picture that I thought was so cool. It's from the UBC Learning Circle. And I love the way it talks about all the healing and wellness tools that students can have, right? So teaching students what success means, giving them opportunities to learn about creativity and art like music, right? Helping them to grow strong, teaching them how to be proactive about their physical health and their mental health, building social skills, right? There's so many grassroots organizations in our inner cities that are working so hard to do this, that are trying to counteract a lot of the social injustices that we have in our communities by empowering and uplifting our students. And I think that is crucial because a lot of our Black students are not taught how to do this, aren't taught what wellness and healing means, aren't taught how to look for things that are toxic in their life, right? And so one of the tools is to teach our youth what wellness and healing means so that they can recognize that. Because if you're a fish in a fishbowl and you've been swimming in water your whole life, you don't know that you're swimming in water, right? So if you grow up in a toxic, unhealthy, oppressive, dysfunctional community or household, that's normal to you. That's been normalized because you've never been taught wellness and you've never been taught healing. So part of this last strategy for students is to teach them healing and wellness strategies so that that is normal. And that can start as early as kindergarten. The next piece of that is teaching resilience. Right now, you'd be surprised because youth are just innately resilient, right? But Black youth and brown youth have to be even more resilient to get past all of the oppression and marginalization and all the traumas that come out of systemic racism, right? But we need to have formal training around what resiliency is, because we want our kids to do more than just master the struggle. We want our children to thrive. We want them to know how to grow out of adversity. We want them to know how to adapt. We want them to know how to build positive social networks and social support. We want them to be purposeful, to understand that they innately have gifts. We want them to live with a sense of self-confidence and self-esteem and self-value and self-worth. All that goes into resiliency, right? As opposed to just, okay, I'm gonna master this adversity. So we really need to look at how do we teach our Black students what resiliency means, what it looks like, right? Because resiliency means not only getting back up when you get knocked down, but learning how to do it better so you don't get knocked down the next time, right? So I think in addition to healing and wellness, resiliency is a skill set that we definitely need to be teaching our students. And then finally, self-advocacy. And I'm gonna say something that people find controversial a lot of times, but a lot of our Black communities have not been taught self-advocacy. That includes me. In this country, Black people are viewed as in service, right? We're viewed as making everyone else comfortable. And the majority of our frontline essential workers are Black and brown folks, right? And so we're not often taught what self-advocacy is, how to stand up and speak to our needs. And our students need to learn this. They need to learn how to speak up for themselves. They need to learn how to stay informed. They need to know what their rights are through civics training. They need to learn where to find support when they need it. They need problem-solving skills, self-determination, and how to ask for help, right? And a lot of this has to do with empowering students with civics education, empowering students with with knowledge and resources, but also helping to build self-esteem in students, and then giving students the vocabulary that they need to ask for what they need, right? Black and brown students are often shunned when they speak up for themselves, or they're viewed as being aggressive, right? Or they're not being compliant, right? As opposed to hearing what Black and brown students have to say when they try to speak up for themselves. And so we want to teach self-advocacy so that students are not relying on what's given to them, but they're being proactive in going out and finding what they need for themselves and their loved ones. So that last strategy is teaching our students health and wellness, self-advocacy. Go back, I forgot the second one. Go back to the second slide. Resilience, thank you. My brain went blank. So teaching our educators around anti-racism and ACEs, but teaching our students around health and wellness and resiliency and self-advocacy. Thank you, Katia. So I want to just share resources really quickly. So in terms of anti-racism training, there's another slide that's going to give you a whole host of resources. But if you want somewhere to start, read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And as drastic as that name sounds, this is a phenomenal book. Dr. Joy DeGruy is brilliant in looking at what generational trauma is, how that has been passed down literally through the womb for centuries, how traumatic behaviors have been passed down, why Black men, women, and children behave the way they do, right? So that's a great start for anti-racism training. When it comes to ACEs, The Deepest Well by Dr. Burke Harris, Nadine Burke Harris, who's also another phenomenal, brilliant woman who talks about what ACEs looks like and how that has a long-term effect in the physical, mental, and emotional life of adults who have gone through these traumas as children. So two excellent books. I can personally vouch for both of them if you're looking for somewhere to start. In addition to, next slide. Again, I'm going to recommend the Center for Racial Justice and Education, Dismantling Racism and Transforming Communities. I think that this is an excellent, excellent organization to just go and do some homework, right? And learn about the work that they're doing, because this might very well be an organization that you want to align your school district with. I am so impressed with the work that they're doing, but I'm also impressed with the fact that their staff and their board are very diverse. They have brought people of color to the table and listening to those voices, and they are driving that work. And that's really, really important when it comes to dismantling oppressive systems. Finally, the next slide. So as I promised, I have a list of resources here for organizations and websites, reading material, media. As PJ said, all of this will be available, so it'll be an opportunity to begin to do some homework around what anti-racism looks like and how we can begin to dismantle oppressive systems and further empower and affirm our Black students. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for just giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. And I look forward to any questions that you have.
Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Rocky Romero. Dr. Romero is the CEO and owner of J.R. Romero and Associates, a training and consulting company he started almost 20 years ago. Dr. Romero is a former assistant professor for New Mexico Highlands University School of Social Work in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He served as the co-chair for Governor Richardson's appointed New Mexico Higher Education Department on Cultural Competency Task Force, on executive council member for the New Mexico Consortium for Behavioral Health Training and Research. In addition, Dr. Romero completed his doctoral studies at the University of New Mexico in language, literacy, and sociocultural studies. Dr. Romero has been a trainer and consultant for the National Hispanic Latino MHTTC for the last 10 years. He is focused on culturally appropriate treatment while focusing on reducing health disparities for people of color. So with that, I welcome Dr. Romero.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be back, and thank you to Kimmy for such a great introduction to the content and material, and of course segue to our portion of the presentation. Again, I represent the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology and Transfer Center out of the Universidad del Caribe in Bayamón, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you again for the organizers through the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. So today I'm going to look at kind of understanding, again, looking at it from the broader perspective of understanding racial justice and an impact on student health. More specifically, we'll look at strategies that are most appropriate for the Latinx communities. And then we'll talk a little bit about, again, how language matters within that context as well. Next slide, please. So we really believe, again, implementing culturally responsive and racially responsive mental health services in schools while considering race and ethnicity is all of our responsibility, right? We have a duty to help those that are needing assistance in traversing the world that they've been introduced to through immigration and coming to the United States, and being in an institution within school settings that allows us to have firsthand impact and direct impact to students of color, especially Latinx communities. Next slide, please. So the goal for this section, again, is just to look at kind of best practices, share with you some of the culturally responsive approaches that we've outlined, looking at some of the evidence-based models specific to mental health, and then, of course, scattered throughout, we'll talk about the roles of educators, but also looking at how do you design and implement school-based mental health services that are culturally and racially responsive. And that's where the MHTTC and our technical assistance, again, fully funded through SAMHSA, to help organizations and agencies that specifically serve Latinx populations, to help them develop infrastructure, to adapt best practices, and even to adapt evidence-based practices that may be more appropriately culturally and racially fitting with your population. So a reminder, we want to address the use of language also in this presentation as it relates to Latinos, and of course, most often looking at it in this presentation, its impact on mental health, especially in Latino youth. So we want to recognize how cultural bias, socialization processes, and prejudice impact our use of language. And again, these are some of the reminders from last 2 weeks ago. For those of you that were able to join us for the first session that I did, we talked about how language use many times frames students' experiences within schools and within other institutions that they have contact with. So we want to recognize that language. We also want to identify ways in which language can be used to improve mental health among Latino youth. So using a person-centered approach in language use around empowerment, and like Kimmy introduced, around resiliency and empowerment and self-care. So really looking at what that looks like from a Latinx population is kind of looking at it from, again, a view that is not so much one that criminalizes or even clinically diagnoses students, but more one that understands their journey and the way that their experience has been framed for them. We want to make sure that we take that into consideration before we jump into the intervention kind of portion of our work. Next slide, please. So implicit bias, those of you that were with us last week and those of you that are new, again, just a reminder, it's defined as attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. It contributes to the dynamics of our social interaction. So again, critical self-reflection, as I introduced last week, is very important for us as educators and providers to constantly do, to understand what is our implicit bias, what is and what are the beliefs that are both favorable and not favorable when it comes to interactions and belief systems around racial groups. What is our belief system when it comes to prejudices that maybe we were taught within our family structures? And that's, I hope you all understand that, that's initially where we understand and we come to a definition, in a way, a working definition as young children of what race and racism is. And our families, to a large degree, shape that process, right? And we have to understand that. So sometimes within a school setting, we're working to try to untangle and peel back some of those beliefs through socialization. And I think that's where some of the skills that we're going to introduce today are going to be, I hope for you, helpful. Next slide, please. So again, continuing with implicit bias of, again, unconscious bias, more specifically, hidden bias. Implicit bias suggests that much of our social behavior is driven by learned stereotypes, operate automatically, and therefore sometimes unconsciously, and then we interact with other people. I introduced cognitive dissonance in the discussion 2 weeks ago as well, where at times when we are in a position where we may, as individual educators, providers, or just human beings, recognize our bias and our racist kind of learned behaviors, and we start to speak about that. And because of being politically correct now and all the focus on racism currently, we may catch ourselves in a situation where we are being prejudiced or racist towards a group or an individual that comes from a larger group. And we have to understand that at times then we kind of use cognitive dissonance to push away from that feeling of discomfort that we experience, because by golly, we're not racist. We have brown and black friends, right? And we're colorblind. Well, we have to understand that even with those things, there's still implicit bias that comes into play. And sometimes it's unconscious, and that's where we want you all as providers to pay attention to that. Well, so now kind of looking at this from cultural responsiveness. So we kind of took these first few slides, if you will, as part of a breakdown of how can we as individuals, as human beings, as providers, school social workers or school personnel recognize our own stuff going on. This is now kind of looking at it from a systematic kind of view or institutional view. So recognizing a student's cultural identity, documentation, definitely the family's generational time within the United States, and strategies for acculturation impact their health and well-being. And for us, it's important to understand the 4 kind of concepts that we're talking about here: cultural awareness, cultural identity, cultural fluidity, and cultural humility. So understanding the awareness portion from just, again, being aware of the clients that you serve, the students that you serve, understanding their experience with immigration, with acculturation that has led to their cultural identity development. And then understanding cultural fluidity about how do they kind of go in between cultures, right? To from American culture and dominant culture in US society to their home where they have exposure to a different culture where it may be more of their home country beliefs, cultural beliefs, values of that country. And sometimes that cultural identity and fluidity is in conflict with each other, and we have to help try to resolve that in some way. And then having cultural humility, being aware that we have to be willing to learn as institutions, we have to be willing to be flexible and learn new concepts and ideas, which we're hopeful we introduce to you all today as well. So kind of a little bit more specific. Cultural responsiveness is, again, understanding traditional Latino values, being willing to learn that through cultural humility, allowing the youth voice and your client's voice to be prominent and to speak up without drowning it out about our own preconceived notions of what that group and what that individual should be like or behave like or experience their immigration and acculturation journey like. And then we also have to keep in mind, like I've mentioned, cultural identity, and that includes documentation status, generation in the US, etc. And then lastly, I think we talked about this, practitioner humility. Just being able to learn, being able to be aware, lower our ego a little bit and put that aside and really be able to meet where the client is and where our Latinx community members are in terms of their integration within systems and schools specifically. So how do we implement those effectively, looking at race and considering the language that we use? So again, we're not getting away from kind of this view of how racism has impacted brown students and Latinx communities. It's now taking a picture of how do we respond to that? So it's equitable and inclusive school programming and services. So involve your youth in those decision-making processes, offer unique cultural and linguistic opportunities for diverse students to learn in their home language and their primary language. In schools, we tend to label kiddos that speak Spanish or another language as special education students. And as you all know, that tag that they get, or that label that they get, because they don't speak the dominant language, becomes a label that follows them throughout high school and elementary and junior high, of course. We definitely have to make a conscious effort to address inequities due to systematic oppression. And we talked about this last week. Within schools, we know that certain classes and tracking within schools, like AP classes and classes that are more designed for our brown and black kids, and looking at that through even military recruitment approaches rather than giving them the skills that they need to succeed in college. So we really have to look at how is our school and our institution functioning and kind of pigeonholing, if you will, or putting brown kids and black kids into specific groups rather than giving them the same opportunities that other dominant group kiddos may have. And then understand cultural dissonance and cognitive dissonance, I think, is extremely important, as I mentioned earlier. So a culturally responsive approach, and this kind of comes from the cultural formulation interview, and that looks through the lens of the DSM-5, and it's an interview that you can even pull out there, even if you're not doing specifically diagnosis within the schools. It's a good instrument that you can use and reference and maybe even adapt to be able to do accurate and effective assessment of what the needs of Latino families and young people are. And it looks at all these different points here: immigrants and refugees, explanatory model, looks at cultural identity, level of functioning, psychosocial stressors, looks at caregivers that are involved, right? Extended family and other community-based caregivers. It gives a perspective of school-age children, and if that's obviously populations that are involved in the home, looks at social networking and coping and helping seeking behaviors, as well as the client-patient relationship. So it's really helpful in initially establishing a cultural snapshot of the family that you're working with. So how do we do this? As a direct service provider, there's a few models here that we're introducing that we want you to consider that would help kind of look at this from this cultural and racial lenses of things. So we want to really introduce the mental health promotion model, multi-tier systems of support, even looking at of course, the MST model that's really, I think, well documented in its efficacy. What I would say is that model still needs to be adapted to be culturally and racially responsive to brown and black kiddos. And I think that that's something, of course, that as an agency, if you reach out to us, then I'm sure the Northeast Caribbean MHTTC would be willing to help organizations in their area develop more effective and culturally responsive strategies, even if it is through a model that you already have adopted. So kind of breaking these down a little bit more, the mental health promotion model, again, it looks at the importance of school environment to promote universal and social development, character building, and social and emotional skills. And as you all know, more and more schools are adapting and adopting social emotional learning strategies. And this fits within that, definitely. This model equips staff and educators, again, to implement classroom-based learning around positive behavior, social inclusion, and problem-solving skills. And then lastly, again, looking at social emotional learning as one aspect of the mental health promotion model. The multi-tiered system of support model looks at 3 specific tiers: universal, so all school population; targeted, very specific classroom intervention or subgroups. So that could be whether it's racially driven within your schools. I know last week with Sarah Howell, who gave you guys an overview of the school that she's done work for, that's very specific to first generation immigration and families who have immigrated here. And it really takes a very specific focus on their experience. And as Kimmy mentioned, we've done presentations also as part of the MHTTC around how adverse childhood experiences have also impacted or been developed through a child's immigration experience. And I think that's an important concept that we have to tie these together in terms of Latinx populations and African American populations as well. And then in the intensive, again, is looking at intervention through individual diagnosis and or specific targeted groups. So that's kind of the strategy from this universal to much more of a subgroup or subset as well. Community-based mental health or mental health services in the schools model. This is pretty much the model that we're following as a center, and that's based off of, again, SAMHSA's funding, and has outlined school behavioral health as one of the very specific strategies to be focusing on the last several years or through a 5-year period. This model is to support existing mental health interventions, through the model that we teach on and train on. If this is an area that you want to get your school better trained on, we're able to do that, and it goes through and breaks down each one of these different sections. And one is recruiting and leveraging or implementing a school-based mental health task force, if your school doesn't already have that. This model, to a degree, assumes that there's some movement around mental health within a school already, and most schools obviously do have some sort of intervention available to kiddos. And then the last area here, services, very specific services. So helping schools and organizations develop strategies, and through those services be very specific in the interventions that they're implementing relative to experiences that the Latinx population may be experiencing, like, and Kimmy mentioned this earlier, which I think is great. When you go back to ACEs, you also have to kind of look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And this does a great job of really looking at families and what their immediate needs are connected to the larger school-based, community-based kind of interventions as well. So as we move into kind of now, how do educators and you as providers start to become more racially aware, again, through critical self-reflection, as we started 2 weeks ago and kind of summarized for you all today. But overall goals for educators and other professionals that we can also start to look towards is increased cultural awareness. And we can also talk about racial awareness, right? So, or racism awareness. Kimmy mentioned this, and I spoke about this 2 weeks ago as well, but redlining is alive and well in our communities. Unfortunately, President Trump has racially said that outwardly, that those that are enjoying suburbia don't have to worry about poor community members moving into their communities any longer. And that's a direct, approach that reinforces old patterns of racist behavior connected to institutional racism along redlining and thinking of that. If you're not familiar with redlining, again, there's other books like Kimmy has mentioned, and thank you, Kimmy, for providing those resources as well. But I'll share with you guys other resources here at the end, and of course in our reference page, our bibliography here, it does note some of that as well. The second bullet, advocate for more the use culturally appropriate assessment, the use of culturally appropriate assessment tools, increase engagement with Hispanic and Latino students and families, and connect culturally relevant mental health resources in the surrounding community. Now, another resource that I'm not sure if I mentioned it last week, but Alexander has a great book, The New Jim Crow, and it really talks about the school to prison pipeline that I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. I know Kimmy mentioned it earlier, but that book does a really good job in showing how institutions have criminalized the brown and black body in school settings, and how punishment for very similar instances for their white counterparts have been very harsh and punitive and criminal in many cases. And if we're truly going to address racism and truly look at it through this lens and not be afraid to have those conversations, we have to understand how that still plays out within schools. How kiddos of certain groups are targeted, followed, labeled, and then tracked and continually put into the spotlight and charged with criminal activity when other colleagues and counterpart or their peers may be treated much differently. Next slide, please. So school administrators, I think that you have to have courage. You have to be courageous, and you have to be willing, and you have a bunch of colleagues out here, myself, I'm sure Kimmy and PJ and others, Kati will be more than willing to be advocates and support systems for you all, especially for you as principals, superintendents, administrators. A lot of times we get pressure from other entities to not talk about race, to don't engage those conversations. You have to be courageous enough to enter into your system and outwardly talk about these situations and address them directly head on without trying to push them away, not address them and keep them hidden, you know, in the elephant in the room, so to speak. So create and support opportunities to increase racial and cultural awareness through training and staff development. Reach out to us, the MHTTC, or again, the Northeast Caribbean MHTTC, and we can help with those trainings. We have a plethora of trainings and resources on our website, so please go there and also see what we can help you with. Foster community-based relationships. Definitely include family engagement as one of your goals as a community or school-based agency. Reach out to family members, show them that you're a safe space. You're not a space that's going to report families to immigration or make them feel unwanted or othered within your community. As school personnel, we have to pay attention. If you were a part of the first series that I gave, looking at what language is used within school policy to either alienate, other, or exclude certain racial groups. And then the last bullet here is support the development of school-wide referral protocols for, again, linking Hispanic and Latino communities to the appropriate mental health services in your community. As mental health providers, create and support, again, opportunities to increase cultural awareness, same as the last slide, foster community-based partnerships, support development of school-wide referral protocols. Definitely become more aware of unique situations that Kimmy mentioned and I'm mentioning, but adverse childhood experiences is huge, and we have to pay attention through that and to that, because we know that Latino and Latinx populations that have immigrated experience acculturation stress. They experience migration trauma and discrimination along that journey. So a lot of times adverse childhood experiences comes in many different forms with them. And as Kimmy mentioned in the slide that she showed, we've shown and we've looked at the research, 1 or 2 ACEs increases your chances of suicidality by about 20 to 30%. And that's just 1 or 2 ACEs. Many of our Latinx population students are coming with 3 or 4 ACEs. And that puts them in a very dangerous position for early death, premature death, early exposure to alcohol and drug abuse, early exposure to mental health disorders, and unfortunately suicidality, which we see as a huge phenomenon within our Latinx populations as well. Next slide, please. As educators and paraprofessionals, we want to make sure that, again, seek out cultural awareness training and development. Become trained in mental health first aid, especially, again, educators, typically in curriculum, and my doctoral studies is in education, and I know that not a lot of schools train teachers to be in mental health. So going out and seeking mental health first aid training, it's I think a 6 to 8 hour training. It's really good. It gives you some language and some ideas about signs and symptoms to pay attention to in your classrooms and in your schools. Become familiar with unique and needs of the Latinx population. Recognize, again, migration trauma as opposed to, and it may show up at, especially in elementary and junior high, but even high school, Latinx populations that have physical symptoms or report physical symptoms. And we as providers have to validate that those physical symptoms like stomach ache, headache, body aches may be more connected to mental health and or racist experiences that they've had. And we're seeing that that plays a big part in mental health with our young people today, especially with the language that our leaders choose to use around immigration and around criminalization of people that are seeking asylum in our country. Some of the additional school staff. So we firmly believe, and we've talked about this, that we can't just rely solely on training and getting teachers and providers, counselors, school social workers trained in anti-racism approaches. We have to include custodians. We have to include our food service workers. We have to include the other personnel within schools that young people have interactions with. Seek out that training for them as well, include them in training, engage in helping them to understand the referral protocol for mental health services. So training them on the form to fill out, where to go if they see a student that's struggling with mental health or who's being oppressed or bullied because of racism or cultural difference. And then of course, obviously help them to engage in that training and support them in that as well. As we talked about the first week, a reminder, use of language as part of a transformative experience can be very, very powerful and beneficial. Person-centered language can serve as an agent of change. Increased awareness and self-reflection are needed for those who work with Latin youth of what language do you use to talk about our brown and Black kiddos? Do you use them? Do you use us against them, dichotomies in the language? Do you use language that others, young people like immigrants or that immigrant population or that immigrant body of students in our school, or are you being inclusive, our students, right? Are you being inclusive of saying us? Those are all subtle words and language use that young people, and especially when they're already heightened by how society and our leadership is talking about young people of color and immigration and immigrants to this country, they're very heightened and hypersensitive to that language use, especially when they're traumatized. As many of you know, when people come to us with trauma, their other senses are heightened, emotions especially. We have to be aware of that as personnel that deals with young Latino and African-American young people. So in summary, I'll go ahead and end here. We definitely need to train teachers on implicit bias and other types of cultural competency focused training. Implicit association tests, there's tests that we can share with you. I believe they were included on the first PowerPoint, but we can make sure we send those and host those on the website for the Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC as well. And then create an atmosphere where teachers can identify, discuss, and find solutions for instances of bias, right? Supervision, supervision, supervision is key. And a lot of times when folks get into key administrative positions, they're not so much getting supervision as they once did. Same for teachers, may not be getting supervision as they once did. So how do you start to be able to get connected with other colleagues in the community that can maybe provide some supervision around anti-racism and approaches that may be more culturally appropriate if you're someone that feels like you need that. The last two bullets, like I mentioned here, train, evaluate, retrain, and assess outcome. So once we do trainings, that's not enough for addressing racial and cultural bias or prejudice. We have to evaluate. So doing some initial self-assessments around bias and prejudice, and then reevaluate that, do a training and then reevaluate that again, can be very, very helpful in your development. And as supervisors, being able to, when a provider or a supervisee comes to you with concerns, be able to respond to them with grace and understanding about race and their experience with racism, even if they felt race and racism, understand that and be willing to engage and help them with that conversation. And then the last bullet here, use data to drive your decisions. If you're seeing, like the YRRS Youth Risk and Resiliency studies show, if within your schools, you're seeing kids that are reporting 30–40% of kiddos presenting as hopeless and not seeing hope for their future. Yet on the other side of things, we feel like we're doing our job. We've done cultural awareness training. We've done these things. If the data doesn't match with that and kiddos are still reporting high levels of hopelessness, high levels of suicidality or thoughts, we still need to make some changes, and we need to understand that moving forward, that we have to be willing to be flexible and change as we seek new information with data. I think that is it for me, the question and answer period. And I'll send this out. I think there was and some of you may have seen this in Facebook today, but there was a picture that was of a young brown child, Latinx community, holding onto the cage and a fence. And it just reminds us that as we sit here and talk about racism, we have to remember the brown kids and families that are still incarcerated and kept within a prisoner camp within the land of the United States. And these people are put in prisoner camps under the auspices of immigration policy and illegal immigration. That's another form of institutional racism, right? Changing the language and the way that we describe people that are seeking asylum from violence and oppression to criminals, immigrants, illegal aliens coming here illegally. So in closing, I'll end there. We could go on and on. I'm very thankful again to Kimmy. Thank you for allowing me to share the stage with you, Kimmy. Thank you to PJ and to Tati for being our moderators and for inviting us to present. And I'm hopeful we can continue this work in dialogue moving forward. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Kimmy and Dr. O'Mara. We have a few questions. So Kimmy, for you, I would just ask you in the chat box if you can give us some information on the anti-racism training that you did with the Diocese of Trenton.
Yes, happy to do that.
And also the request is for the resource that you talked about, the pipeline articles.
Yes, that actually, Dr. Romero shared that, and it is The New Jim Crow by Dr. Alexander. So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Chat as well. Okay, and then there was just one more statement, but I want to kind of turn it into a question. So there was a panelist, there was a participant who wanted us to give some thoughts on the incident where the policeman put handcuffs on a 5-year-old boy with disabilities who was having problems at school. And I want to turn that into a question in terms of not our opinions of that, but how can we address that with our students in classrooms so that we can correct those kinds of things and correct the stereotypes around those kinds of behaviors in communities?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Dr. Merrill, please feel free to jump in at any time. That goes back to really recognizing what systemic racism is and how that plays into our biases. For anybody who's done their homework on historic racism, our law enforcement were actually created originally as slave catchers. That was their job, was to police and was to protect white people and white property and to catch Black folks and to kill indigenous. That's not opinion, that's fact. And so a lot of those biases continue in law enforcement today. And part of that is adultifying and criminalizing young Black and brown children. So in addition to that 5-year-old that was handcuffed, we have a mother who had 4 girls in her car, and the police surrounded the car, pulled her and all the children out. They're all handcuffed and laying on the floor in broad daylight. The 2 young Black boys who actually called the police themselves because they had been robbed. And when the cops showed up, they pulled the guns on them. So all of these play into the way law enforcement and the way our educational system, the discipline systems in our educational systems view Black children. And they're not viewed as children, they're viewed as little adults who are violent and are some way a threat. So you asked how we can undo this. Again, it goes back to really having training around where these ideas and concepts come from and how they have been built into the systems that we create in our school systems. And it comes down to education, education, education. You have to understand the elephant in the room, which is systemic racism. And then that helps you to see through different eyes and understand the way different systems are oppressive to one children and very different for other children. And so again, I think it goes back to really recognizing how our educational systems have been built and how Black children fall into the concept of being criminalized and then literally pushed into that pipeline into prison, right? So excellent book by Dr. Michelle Alexander. I'll make sure I put that in the chat. And Dr. Romero, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thank you, Kimmy. I think that's excellent, and I would just add to that in the fact that we tend to, and we're tending to see it more in schools. We tend to almost, well, police our schools, right? With having police officers within schools, not just security officers anymore that have batons and pepper spray and all that good stuff, but now we have armed police officers in schools. And we had an instance here in New Mexico where a special education child was in a situation like that, and instead of them following his individual education plan as they're legally supposed to, law enforcement and sheriff's officer was called, who was stationed within the school, proceeded, because of the behaviors that were already in his IEP, decided to kind of ignore that, proceeded to tase the child 3 times and throw him on the ground. And this was maybe a 90-pound young 15-year-old male. And again, so I think one policy change that we can look at, and all of you as advocates can look at, and I get it, sometimes we have to be aware, but when we feel so threatened that we have to arm our schools with police officers, something else is going on within that institution as well, that is making young people feel like they have to respond violently in an environment where they're supposed to be kept safe. Right. So I think policies that we've looked at here in New Mexico, one specifically that we've called on public education department to initiate immediately, is to remove all armed police officers from schools. And those can be policy changes that we advocate for that can turn around this policing and the school to prison pipeline to a degree. But I agree with Kimmy. I think it's, again, around training, and undoing some of the systemic kind of elements that has already been implemented long ago. Thank you.
Okay, and we have one more question in the Q&A for both of you. As a Board of Ed member, how do I get the buy-in from Board of Ed to educate themselves about anti-racism and marginalized groups?
I'll go ahead and start on that one. I think that's part of the requirements that community members need to hold school board potential candidates accountable for, right? And making sure that it's not just a talking point on their platform for election and selection, but it's part of more embedded within their platform of how they're going to address some of those things. And I think for the existing board members, I think that when you start to look at it from the potential of lawsuits and legal discourse to take shape now, because we have a lot more spotlight on racism and racist acts, I think that schools have to be much more proactive in addressing this before they get themselves caught up in legal discourse and legal action. And you're seeing a lot of advocacy groups that support brown and black kiddos and families that are now taking these racist accounts much more seriously. And when we start to see the liability that's involved in that from an administrator, right? If we can't get people to change, it's harder to change people's hearts and minds than to get them to change, because we know it's going to hit them monetarily too, right? So we have to think about that and leverage that intervention, if you will.
Thank you very much.
Earlier, PJ, I put information in the chat on both the new Jim Crow and the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey anti-racism training. There's actually an online training coming up in September. So that link, you can actually click on that link in the chat and it'll take you right to the registration page.
Great. I'm going to turn it back to Kati, and she's going to walk us through the completion of your evaluations.
Thank you, PJ. And again, thank you to Kimmy and Dr. Romero for joining us today and providing us with such valuable information. And as mentioned before, especially during this current social climate, these trainings are very valuable, very informative. And based on the feedback that we saw in the chat box and our private comments, you know, all of the wealth of information, the resources is very welcome. So like PJ said, on your screen, you see a QR code. If you could please either take a moment to complete the survey via the QR code. I will also be sending a link to our survey, and as well as following up with another email to the link to the recordings, the presenter slides, and a certificate of attendance. I will also put in there an invitation to our school mental health conference that we're hosting, and I will link the registration information. It's on August 19th and 20th, and we will be sending registration links to particular training workshops by the end of this week. Our contact information is on this screen as well. You can either call us, email us, or visit our website. We also have a Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn page. And then in the email, I will also list my contact information. If you have any specific questions to our presenters, you can also send it to us and we can forward it to them, or I can also include it in the email. And then in the presentation slides, we also include all of the references that were discussed today, as well as resources. So again, we thank you for joining us, and thank you, PJ, Dr. Romero, and Kimmy, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you stay safe and well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.